Hi there, Tanse. Bonjour. My name is Kim Barker Kay, and I'm going to share with you my work on how I was able to build educational equity for Indigenous students. This work involved extensive time, research, and experience over the course of many years. And even though this actual presentation is focused on Indigenous students and advancing education for reconciliation, much of it is relevant to all minority students and education. I'll share a glimpse into my own personal journey from the inside out and give you an introduction to the work of elders, educators, and researchers that help guide this effort. I invite you to think about your own personal and educational context as this presentation unfolds. Where are you located geographically? What's your role in education? Are you a teacher, an educational support, an administrator, or do you work for central office? What pieces of this presentation might work for you as you strive for building educational equity? Before we begin, it would be helpful to have the recommended handouts in front of you to follow along. Also, periodically, you'll see a slide that lets you know when you can pause and take a look at the learning guide that has reflection questions, discussion questions, and possible next steps for you. I'm grateful to be doing this presentation from Treaty 8 territory and the homeland of the Métis people. I'm sitting here in my home in High Prairie in the Peace Country. So this is me, and you'll see that it says relationships first, always. A Cree elder who is my teacher once told me that before doing business of any kind, we always must build relationships first. I was trying to figure out how am I going to do this on a PowerPoint presentation or a slide presentation. And I thought that probably the best way is just to introduce myself and give you a bit of information about me and my context. The other thing you could do is if you're with a larger group is you could pause it and share a little bit about yourself with everyone else who's in your circle. So as mentioned before, my name is Kim Barker Kay, and I'm from High Prairie in northern Alberta. I spent 35 years as a teacher, a principal, and a researcher in this geographical area. Along the way, I taught almost every grade from kindergarten to adult education. I have a master's degree in educational studies that focused on the roles and responsibilities of Native liaison workers in northern Alberta. I also spent almost 10 years as the protege of a Cree elder, and this experience led me to a deep inside out journey mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. The benefits to me, my husband, and my children have been unparalleled. I retired at 55 and later began working as a consultant for the Northwest Regional Learning Consortium out of Grand Prairie. And my area of focus is education for reconciliation. My family moved to High Prairie in the mid 1960s when I was in grade 1. I grew up and went to school in a time and place impacted dramatically by the 60s scoop, by residential schools, and changes being made in the Indian Act, not to mention a time of dramatic changes in Alberta for the Métis. This map shows the area around High Prairie that impacted my life and career. My career involved working many years at the Alberta Vocational Centre in Grouard, which is now known as Northern Lakes College, and with High Prairie School Division number 48, which stretches from Falher to Slave Lake. Our schools serve students from all communities and areas visible on this map, which includes 3 of Alberta's 8 Métis settlements and 6 or 7 First Nations communities. To provide further context, there were at least 7 residential schools in our area, including St. Bruno's in Joussard and St. Bernard's in Grouard. It was within this context that I grew up, became a teacher and a principal, and tried to figure out why there was an education gap and how to remove it. This quest took me places personally and professionally that I could never have imagined. When I was in my last year before retirement, the NRLC, or the Northwest Regional Learning Consortium, asked if I would consider consulting. I took a year to re energize and refocus. It was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action that ultimately kept me out of retirement, especially number 7, which you see on the screen in front of you. This had been the focus of my life's work, and now was the right time to share. It's at this point that you could pause the presentation and follow the instructions or the guides on Learning Guide number 1, Your Context. In this next section, I share some of our early successes at removing the education gap. I'm going to begin by sharing some of our success stories, and then I'll go into the actual research. The first one took place in the mid-2000s when I was part of a team with High Prairie School Division. We began at a school called High Prairie Elementary, which was a K-6 school with about 450 students. I had a support role as a First Nations, Métis, and Inuit lead teacher. And our team also included an AC lead teacher, or Alberta Initiative for School Improvement, and a new principal who had been part of our AC team. When we began, there was a very large achievement gap, and there were low achievement test results overall. After 2 years, it was really amazing to see that 100% of the grade 3 students were at the acceptable standard on the Language Arts Provincial Achievement Test. There was also significant improvement on accountability pillar results, High Prairie School Division survey results for safe and caring, and for welcoming school culture. We were unable to carry on with the third year because of changes within the district, but needless to say, we were quite encouraged. Our success at High Prairie Elementary School gave me the courage to agree to apply our research in an outreach school in High Prairie. And you can see it's called Prairie View Outreach. The story began in 2009 and continued on to 2013. You can see that on the slide we had 98% First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students over those 4 years. And without having intended to ever be an administrator, I became a principal. In 2009, they were thinking of closing the school down when I began. So it was quite the thing that I walked into. There was a high level of violence and drugs and graffiti and gangsta attitudes. The school culture was toxic. People of the community were afraid of the school and of the students. It was rough when I first walked in, and it was basically standing there looking around going, holy man, where do I begin? When people started hearing that I was going to be principal of the outreach school, I received a lot of well-intentioned advice. Much of it had to do with raising the hammer and strong discipline and being very assertive, and lots of suspensions and expulsions. And I thought deeply about that, and I thought, if I did that, we probably won't have any students left. So probably not a good idea. Armed with the mantra of no excuses and no blame, we applied the research. The results were astounding considering where we had begun. It was so gratifying and satisfying in 2011-12 when we had our first 3 graduates. Prairie View Outreach had not had any graduates that I was aware of up until that time. And the following year to have 7, that was amazing. I'm happy to report that even still today, the graduation rates and success of the students has continued to increase. With the odd blips here and there, they're still doing really well. What's really cool to me is that of those 10 from 2011 to 2013, I'm still in touch with many of those students, and some of them went on to different degrees of post-secondary, and each one of those is just a major story in and of itself that's really neat to listen to. As you look at this data on suspensions and expulsions over the 4 years, It's important to note that the students remained pretty much the same over this period. What did change was the culture of the school, the leadership, and the focus on education and student goals. We had minimal rules, but developing high expectations and a deep seated culture of respect was a key focus of the work that we did. For example, we didn't have any swearing rules, and at the beginning of the year, holy man, it was sometimes hard to be there. But in year 3, I started to notice that the only students swearing were new students that were coming into the school. The veterans who had been there for a while would tune the new ones in quickly with such comments as, "We don't talk like that here." So, the big question is, how did we do it? It started in 2005. The Alberta government infused new money into districts and schools called First Nations, Métis, and Inuit funding. Basically, the money was to be used to figure out how to close the achievement gap between Indigenous and non Indigenous students. High Prairie School Division hired 2 of us to try and figure this out. Included in the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit 4 goals was a call to identify the barriers to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit student achievement, and through research, find out how to remove them. Pauline Auger, my work partner, and I set out to do just that. When you look at this map, you'll see far to the west is Falher, and to the east, on the far side of the east, is Slave Lake. To the north, we have Peavine, Gift Lake, Atikamekw or Whitefish First Nation, and to the south, East Prairie Métis Settlement. For 6 months, Pauline and I conducted an intensive broad research to identify barriers from Falher to Slave Lake, including most of the communities that were home to our students. We used questionnaires, surveys, community meetings, focus groups, one-on-one chats over tea or coffee with students, teachers, administrators, support staff, parents, community members, elders, and leaders. At the end of that 6 months, Pauline and I compiled our results and wrote an executive summary that identified 8 barriers that were common across the district. We then set out to research the best ways available at that time to remove these barriers. If you have the handouts, this would be a really good time to pull out the one on the 2005 barriers so that you can refer to them as we move along. A couple of things I'd like to point out. The barriers are not in any specific order, and also the vocabulary that's used was acceptable at that time that we wrote this up. So the first one is issues of racism. Second, stakeholders' lack of cultural awareness. 3, weak or non-existent school community parent relationships. 4, low number of Aboriginal staff and teachers within the schools. 5, lack of authentic Aboriginal content and practices in the curriculum. 6, low occurrence of Cree language at all grade levels. 7, predominance of lowered expectations of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students. 8, some schools do not reflect an environment that is respectful and accepting of all cultures and minority groups. So 12 years later, these barriers have continued to be relevant. Also, because of the TRC calls to action and the moves towards reconciliation, some of these barriers are being directly addressed and positive movement is noticeable. For example, barriers 2 and 5 are seeing some progress thanks to land-based learning, changes to the TQS and LQS, and many changes are happening with curriculum and the way we teach Canadian history. I've categorized our strategies for removal of these barriers into 4 parts, which I'm going to share with you. In our search for answers, Pauline and I often felt like we were sailing the 7 seas. But in the end, I've taken our findings, or what became part of my personal journey, and put them into these 4 areas. Each of these 4 was critical to me in the work that I did in building school students' success. But it was number 4, Curtis Linton's equity framework, along with the work of other great educational researchers that provided me with a framework that guided our schools work towards educational equity. Before looking more intently at each of these 4 areas, I'd like to qualify that what I'm sharing with you is what worked for me within my context. To begin your own inside out journey, it's important that you identify the needs and barriers for yourself, for your classroom, school, or your district before you start looking for answers. So, this is a really good place to stop and follow some of the suggestions in Learning Guide 2A. And it's called Your Inside Out Journey, Your Contextual Data. To address issues of racism, Pauline and I came upon an outfit called the National Coalition Building Institute, or the NCBI. It's a nonprofit organization out of Washington, D.C., that was doing some great work around issues of racism and other forms of oppression. We had the opportunity to become participants/observers in a 2-day training session that was led by young people in Sudbury, Ontario. We very quickly knew that this was it. The methodology and philosophy worked really well. We were looking for methodologies that didn't leave people feeling guilt or feeling bad about themselves in the process. I learned that this is not helpful and that guilt is the glue that holds racism in place. So, NCBI, the approach begins with the conviction that all human beings are fundamentally good. And in this work, people are not shamed or blamed for attitudes and values that they may have. The other key piece that attracted us was the leadership training and skills development. Very, very well thought out and done well. Another guiding belief of the National Coalition Building Institute is that welcoming diversity means every person counts and every issue counts. Part 2 of my Inside Out journey is even more deeply personal. Between the NCBI work and elders' teachings, I was guided on my Inside Out path. I learned about things that were getting in my way, and I learned how to deal with them. For example, physically, I learned how to deal with having multiple sclerosis, and from there, learned how to keep myself as balanced as possible. Another example of things getting in my way were deep seated negative feelings about spirituality and religion, anger about racism, guilt about being white and of my British heritage. I also learned how to be comfortable with conversations around white privilege and how to identify stereotypes I had about different groups and how to remove them. Additionally, I learned how to feel good about myself and my identity. And I also learned leadership skills to help me to help others with their own inside out path. Here's an opportunity to pause the presentation and take a look at Learning Guide 2B. I've shared quite a few very personal things with you, and I encourage you to take a look at the questions to guide you further on your own path. Part 3 of my personal learning journey included increasing my cultural learning and intelligence. As I mentioned before, I had the unusual and unique experience of being mentored and taught by a Cree elder and his wife, who was also a healer. This happened over the course of almost 10 years and allowed me to be quasi immersed in Cree culture, traditions, protocols, and language. This isn't an experience that's going to happen for many people, but today the land based learning movement in education can fill this learning need for both students and educators. The requirements of the teaching quality standards and leadership quality standards make it non negotiable for educators to build foundational knowledge and to relearn Canadian history in a more authentic way. So I think this personal journey piece can happen for everyone. We just need to take action and learn as much as we can. Learning guide number 3 gives you a chance to personally reflect on your own learning, and it also shares some resources with you to help build your foundational knowledge. Finally, we're at part 4, the equity framework. This is the framework that provided that foundational piece, along with the other 3 parts, that guided my work as a leader in closing that achievement gap. This framework has the term equity at the center, and it's got 4 other words surrounding it that provide those foundational pieces. And then the 3 circular areas are the 3 areas that need to be balanced. There's culture, practice, and leadership. Curtis Linton wrote a book in 2011 called Equity 101, the Equity Framework. But Pauline and I came upon his work years before that through the School Improvement Network that doesn't exist right now. So what had happened is that after years of ACE and hard work by Alberta's educators, minority student achievement was still not improving. So Pauline and I were on a quest. What was the missing piece? What was missing? This framework provided us with those missing pieces. Other researchers, such as Anthony Mohammed and Mike Matos, talk about that missing piece in education as well. We tend to focus so much of our time and attention as educators in the area of practice, which is making teachers better teachers. In fact, making Alberta teachers some of the best in the world. But that missing piece is the culture, or a healthy school culture. If the school culture is toxic, minority students are not likely to learn. If the school culture is healthy, minority student achievement will increase. And as you'll see in the next few slides, culture means so much more than just walking into a school and everyone's happy and everyone feels comfortable. There's so much more to this word. The third circle, leadership. In this instance, leadership refers to the principal. The principal leads the way. If you have the handout on the equity framework in front of you, I'd like to point out that at the bottom of the front of the page is a deeper explanation of the 4 common characteristics in the center of the model. And at the back of the page, on the back of the page, is a deeper explanation of the 3 circles of practice, leadership, and culture. At the top of the first page is your definition, according to Curtis Linton, of educational equity, which is defined as educators provide all students with the individual support they need to reach and exceed a common standard. At the bottom of the next few slides, I've put a barrier and some numbers there. What I've tried to do is correlate the barriers from Pauline's and my research in 2005, which is on your barriers handout, to what's being talked about on the slide. So in the center of the equity framework is the word equity, and those 4 common characteristics are written down around there. These are the things that can be observed in equitable schools. They're at the center of the framework and foundational pieces. Pervasive about the research on low minority student achievement across North America is the predominance of low expectations. If nothing else resonates with you in this presentation, that one is the biggie. Expectations set the bar for high achievement, and predominantly teachers, well-intentioned, skilled, wonderful teachers commonly will have lower expectations of minority students. This isn't a judgment, it's just a statement of fact from the research over years and years and years. Barrier number 7 on your handout is the one that was identified in 2005, and it continues to be a huge factor in minority student achievement. John Hattie's research, by the way, if you aren't familiar with it, you can even Google Hattie's 2017 updated list of factors influencing student achievement. His research shows that there is a powerful impact of teacher expectations on student learning. At the outreach school, we had to learn about our own expectations for learning with our students. We had to learn about our biases, our practices. We also had to learn about how to increase our expectation of all students. And that's sometimes not a really easy thing to do. But making it come to the being metacognitive of what our thinking was and what our thoughts were was really helpful, and being able to articulate our expectations. We had to also ensure that our students were receiving rigorous challenges in their learning so that they had the skills and knowledge necessary for the next stages in their education. Sometimes educators will tend to water down the curriculum and the content and the skills. And this is not helpful for students in the long run. It's just not. We had to consider our students' worldviews and learn about them in order to connect the learner with the instruction in the curriculum, making it relevant. This again involved our staff articulating very clearly, how do we make this relevant? Let's have conversations with students about building relevancy. And then, of course, the key relationships. We had to look at relationships in a different way. We had to ensure that our relationships with students and each other allowed for effective and authentic communication across our differences. Jamie Almanzon is an educator and researcher from California, and he refers to this as respeto, or a very deep form of respect and understanding of our students' day-to-day lives. And this is how we can start to build a very deep, respectful relationship with our students. And now you can pause and take a look at Learning Guide number 4, the Equity Framework Foundational Characteristics. This next section will help you go deeper into understanding the equity framework, and will take you specifically through leadership, practice, and culture. The first circle I'll focus on is leadership. If you look at the framework up in the top left corner, you'll notice that I've put the word gardener under the word leadership. Anthony Mohammed and Mike Matos talked about increasing achievement for all students through the analogy of a garden. If you think of the principal of the school as the gardener, the culture would be the soil and the practice would be the seeds. So just as a gardener balances the building a healthy soil and using strong, competent seeds to build a healthy garden, the leadership or the gardener, also the leadership of the school, needs to balance the culture and practices in order to build equity. So, as the principal of the outreach schools, my work was to build educational equity. And I did this through having strong vision and direction, taking on the responsibility of holding my educators accountable, and taking on the responsibility of sustaining the innovation. As the principal of the outreach schools, by year 4, I was responsible for 3 outreach schools. And I used this framework and these 3 big areas of culture, practice, and leadership to guide not only my leadership, but my own personal professional development as well. I used ideas from other educational researchers as well to strengthen my leadership. For example, Anthony Mohammed's book, Transforming School Culture, helped me to fill in areas that maybe Curtis Linton's work wasn't quite helping me with. So I was able to read a lot of other educational researchers' work and pick and choose what worked for me within my context. Once again, you can pause and stop and take a look at Learning Guide number 5, which will take you into a little bit deeper understanding of leadership as it relates to the equity framework. The second circle is entitled Practice, and this includes curriculum, teaching skills, assessment, and interventions. Essentially, this is teaching using best practices, using high yield strategies. For example, paying attention to John Hattie's research and what encompasses high yield strategies. Another example is RTI, response to intervention. Sometimes, as educators, we tend to use low yield strategies without even thinking about it. So it's just becoming aware of what our practices are and are they high yield. At the outreach schools, my team worked with each student individually to co plan their educational path. We ensured that they were receiving instructional support that worked for each of them and that all were receiving rigorous curriculum. We were quick to assess what wasn't working and were very quick to change and try something different immediately. We focused on high yield strategies, interventions, and assessment, and we did it collaboratively. It's time to pause again and take a look at Learning Guide number 6, which focuses on practice. And now we've arrived at the missing link, which is culture. Underneath culture, the elements are professional attitudes, clear focus on students, build racial awareness, build an inclusive environment, and collaboration. Mike Matos and Anthony Muhammad, through their work with Solution Tree, created the metaphor of a garden around school culture. If leadership is the gardener and practice is the seeds, culture is the soil. In order to have strong plants, the seeds need to be healthy and strong, and the soil must be healthy as well. If the plants aren't growing well and the seeds are top notch, then the gardener needs to figure out what needs to be changed with the soil. Keeping a school culture healthy and fertile is crucial and involves continuous hard work on 3 levels: the personal, school level, and the institutional level. Do you personally have the will to dive into this work? Do you think your school is ready? Here's some questions to help you understand what's meant by professional attitudes. Does your staff demonstrate a deep respect for all students? Do your teachers have high expectations of all their students? Do your teachers take responsibility for student learning? The second characteristic of school culture is clear focus on students. Are learning goals established clearly in the classrooms and focused on the students? Does your staff deeply understand their students, their learning styles, their ethnic background, economic background, and so on and so on? At the outreach school, we were deeply committed to knowing our students, their families, their communities, and tried hard to learn about the day-to-day lives that they lived. When I think back on my many years of teaching, there are times I wish I could almost go back. And part of it is because I'd like to have learned more about some of my students and their lives. For example, I had Muslim students, but knew very little about Islam. I also had students from the Philippines and had very little knowledge about their country or culture. The third element of school culture is building an inclusive environment. Does anyone in your school feel alienated or excluded? Do your staff and students feel safe to take risks? Is there authentic celebration of success in your school? The piece on safety was interesting to me when I was first learning about it. I had a certain conception of what safety meant. And as I read deeper into Curtis Linton's work, I understood that, and this makes sense to me, is do people feel safe to make mistakes? Do they feel that they're not going to have repercussions, that they can take risks? Can they try new things? I mean, it's how we learn, right? Both staff and students. But if you don't feel safe, you're not going to do it. Authentic celebration I found was key in the outreach school as well. Um, Learning or teaching students how to feel intrinsic reward was really important to our kids. The extrinsic rewards at the beginning didn't work and they weren't very helpful. But as we were able to help students build up that feeling of intrinsic pride and celebration, um, things became much more authentic, and success really was breeding success in our school. Most of what we did at the outreach schools was deeply collaborative. A couple of questions here. Are strong collaborative relationships being built with students, parents, and the community, or communities? In our case, there were a number of communities. Does your staff work as a team? We learned that for survival and for effectiveness, we had to work as a team. There was no question about it. We were a team on all fronts. I have so many stories of how we collaborated, including one example is how every morning we met casually before students started to arrive. And we also met at the end of every day to talk about anything that needed discussion, including sometimes our own mental and emotional well being, so that we were supporting each other that way. Usually, we talked about the progress of students who had been there that day and students we hadn't seen for a while, and how are we going to try to connect with those kids or their family or their parents. So, our efforts were very collaborative. I even have stories of uh, trips we would make, or I would make, to East Prairie Métis Settlement or to Peavine or some of the other communities, and sometimes do home visits if we hadn't seen a student for a while. And if they didn't have internet access, what were some other ways that we could look at to figure out how to support the student? Sometimes it meant going into the settlement office for an hour here and an hour there and using the internet. At that time, it wasn't overly common for everybody to have internet access, but we figured things out working together. And now it's time to take a look at Learning Guide number 7, which focuses on school culture. If any one of these equity characteristics is missing from an individual student's experience in school, that student is likely not to succeed. Um, and that's a quote from Equity 101, the Equity Framework, Curtis Linton, 2011, through Corwin and Sage Company. This is a picture of the two books that are available right now. He's put one out on specifically on culture, and there's one coming out on practice and one coming out on leadership, hopefully soon. Um, I'm hoping they'll be out sometime in 2020, is what I'm seeing on Amazon, I guess. So I've given you a really cursory look at Curtis Linton's equity framework and a glimpse at a few other pieces helpful in closing the achievement gap. And some of this was very personal to me, and I hope there were bits that resonated with you and will be helpful. I also hope that you were able to correlate the 8 barriers that Pauline and I identified in 2005 and the removal of those barriers to the research and action that I've shared with you. It's a work in progress. It's going to take a lot of time to fully get there, I think, provincially, but I think we're on a path in a good way. So before ending this presentation, I'm going to ask you to humor me, and I'm going to ask you to please close your eyes. With your eyes closed, picture a class of students that you've either taught or visited recently in the last school year. Look closely at each face in front of you. As you're looking at these faces in this classroom, do you believe that all students can succeed with a rigorous curriculum and be at grade level year after year, regardless of race, ethnicity, economics, language, gender, and cultural backgrounds? You can open your eyes now. Here's the question for you on this visualization exercise. Did your answer include the word but? Yes, I believe this, but. If that's the case, then you're not quite there yet. High expectations for all our students is critical, especially for minority student achievement. There's so much research out there regarding high expectations in education, and I encourage you to look more deeply. If you have the handouts, I've provided a resource list under school culture, the soil, and there's a book by L.S. Kaplan and W.A. Owings that offers some actions that you can take to examine your own expectations and make changes if needed. And I'll give you the title here on the next slide. Here's that title for you. After the many years of work, research, conversation, bumps along the road, I'd like to provide a reflection of my personal journey to building educational equity. I had to learn to believe deeply that all students can reach and exceed a common standard. No buts. I had to stop making excuses for and rationalizing low achievement. No blame and no excuses. I had to learn to take responsibility for low student achievement. I had to learn about my own stereotype records and examine them in order to be able to welcome differences. I had to do some personal healing. I had to increase my foundational knowledge about Indigenous history, treaties, residential schools, worldviews, etc., something that I continue to work on almost daily. Reconciliation cannot occur without listening, contemplation, meditation, and deeper internal deliberation. So we've come to the end of this presentation. There's 2 more slides after this one, but I have a couple more closing items for you. First, when you're reflecting on all that's just been presented, what are 1 or 2 actions that you can take immediately? Second, there's a learning guide number 8 with some ideas to help you on your equity journey. If you'd like more information about this presentation or you'd like to book an actual in-person presentation, please feel free to contact either me directly or the Northwest Regional Learning Consortium. Thank you. Merci. Kinenaskumpten.